It's tough being a teenager, right? The drama, the pressure, all those emotions running wild.
It's a recipe for disaster, some might say.
Well, imagine going through all that while battling some serious mental health challenges on top of it.
That's a whole other level of complicated.
That's the reality at the heart of the Carly Gregg case in Mississippi.
A case that's been haunting folks for months now.
And that's why we're here, ready to unpack it all. We're going deep on the story of Carly Gregg.
Trying to piece together what could lead a 15-year-old down such a dark path.
And let me tell you, this isn't just another courtroom drama, is it?
Absolutely not. This case goes way beyond the courtroom.
It's forcing us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about mental health.
Family dynamics, too. Let's not forget that.
Oh, yeah, and the justice system, how it works, how it doesn't.
And we've got a mountain of information to sift through. Court transcripts, psychological evaluations, you name it.
Even local news coverage trying to make sense of this whole thing.
Everyone wants to understand, and rightfully so.
So where do we even begin? Let's start with Carly.
15 years old.
A student at the very same high school where her mom, Ashley Smiley, taught.
Talk about pressure.
Living at home with her mom and her stepdad, Heath Smiley. And here's the thing. Carly was pretty open about her struggles with depression.
Anxiety too, right?
Yeah, and it wasn't just teenage angst. We're talking self-harm, medication.
This was serious stuff. And, understanding that context is crucial here.
Because
During adolescence, that part of the brain that handles impulse control, long-term decisions.
still under construction.
Exactly. So you throw in some pre-existing mental health conditions.
Like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand.
And expecting it to withstand a hurricane. And believe me, Carly's world was about to get very stormy.
And let's not forget those universal teenage struggles. Relationships, school pressures, social media.
Oh, social media. Don't even get me started.
It's like adding fuel to a fire, isn't it?
More like dumping gasoline on an already raging inferno.
And tragically for Carly, that fire exploded on March 20th, 2024.
The day everything changed.
A heated argument with her mom, Ashley, the kind that probably feels all too familiar to some people listening.
Especially those who remember being teenagers themselves.
It reportedly started over something pretty common. Ashley found Carly's vape pens.
Ah, the classic parent-teenager clash.
But this wasn't just a typical argument. It spiraled out of control.
Ending in a way nobody could have predicted.
Carly shot her mother in the face with a .357 Magnum.
Just let that sink in for a moment. A .357 Magnum.
It's chilling.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to get caught up in the shock value of it all.
Oh, absolutely. But we have to remember what we said about context.
Right. Was this calculated? Or was it a desperate act? A mind pushed to its absolute breaking point?
These are the questions that we're going to be grappling with throughout this entire deep dive.
And here's where it gets even more complex. Instead of calling for help after the shooting,
Carly did the unthinkable.
she invited a friend over. And get this, she asked her friend if they were squeamish around dead bodies.
Yeah, that's a detail that sends chills down your spine, and it raises a whole other set of questions.
Like, what was going on in her mind?
Was this a sign of premeditation, cold-blooded planning? Or could it have been shock?
Maybe even a twisted attempt to cling to some sense of normalcy in the middle of this nightmare she created.
It's a puzzle, and human behavior, especially in extreme situations, is rarely straightforward.
Of course, the investigation kicked off immediately.
They dug deep into Carly's life, her family, everything.
And what they found was a family under immense pressure.
Carly's mental state, it wasn't a secret.
But was it ignored? Or was it just misunderstood?
Those are the nuances that are really hard to get a handle on, even with all the information in the world.
And then there's the trial. This small-town tragedy, it captivated the nation.
Everyone was watching. Everyone had an opinion.
It became this national conversation about mental health, about accountability.
And where do you even draw the line when it comes to something like this?
Right, because it's not so simple, is it?
Not even close.
The prosecution's case, it seemed pretty straightforward at first glance.
They painted a picture of Carly as this, almost calculating mastermind.
They kept coming back to her behavior after the shooting, right?
Especially that bone-chilling question to her friend, squeamish around dead bodies. I mean, come on.
For them, it all pointed to a lack of remorse.
Zero remorse in their eyes. But the defense, they came at it from a completely different angle.
They wanted the jury to see Carly not as a criminal mastermind, but as
a victim herself.
Yeah.
A young woman in the clutches of a mental health crisis, completely overwhelmed. They argued her depression was so severe.
So debilitating.
Exactly. That she simply wasn't in her right mind when she pulled that trigger.
That she wasn't capable of even forming intent, legally speaking.
They said she couldn't possibly understand the weight of her actions, the consequences.
To bolster their case, they brought in expert witnesses.
Big names in the field of psychology, folks who had evaluated Carly, reviewed her history,
And their testimony focused on.
her lifelong struggle with depression, painting a picture of a mind in turmoil.
So it became this battle of legal insanity versus medical insanity.
Exactly. Two very different concepts that often get muddled in the public eye.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I'm still a little fuzzy on the distinction.
Well, think of it this way. Medical insanity means a mental illness prevents you from understanding reality, period.
Okay, so it's like being colorblind, but for your perception of right and wrong.
Not a bad way to put it. But legal insanity, that's a whole other ballgame.
So what does legal insanity hinge on?
It hinges on whether someone, due to mental illness, was unable to understand that what they were doing was wrong at the time of the crime.
Okay, so like they knew they were pulling the trigger, but
But their brain couldn't process that it was wrong. Their judgment was clouded by their illness.
that's got to be incredibly difficult to prove in court, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where things get even more tangled.
Tangled how?
Carly's biological father, Kevin Gregg, he became a central figure in the trial.
Really? What was his take on everything?
He actually testified for the prosecution.
Whoa, that's unexpected.
He firmly believed Carly knew exactly what she was doing and should be held accountable. No ifs, ands, or buts about it.
He didn't believe in the insanity defense at all.
Not one bit. He insisted his daughter, his own flesh and blood, knew the difference between right and wrong.
I can't even imagine being in his shoes. The weight of that situation, the guilt, the grief, the anger.
It's a level of heartbreak most of us will thankfully never know. And it shines a light on the impossibly difficult situation families dealing with mental illness often face.
They're forced to become accidental experts on something they never asked for.
Absolutely. And in this case, it gets even more complicated.
How so?
Kevin's testimony, it wasn't just about Carly's accountability, it was about Ashley, too.
His ex-wife, Carly's mother.
He wanted justice for her, for the life that was taken, and that's understandable, right? But it adds this whole other layer of complexity to an already impossible situation.
It really highlights how messy things get when you're talking about mental illness. It's not always clear-cut who the victim is it?
And it certainly muddies the waters when it comes to justice and accountability. This isn't a simple open and shut case.
So you got this young woman battling her own demons, you've got a family ripped apart by tragedy, and you've got a community, heck, a whole nation holding its breath, waiting for a verdict.
The tension was palpable, and after weeks of testimony, evidence, arguments, the jury finally reached a decision. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, attempted murder of her stepfather even though he wasn't home at the time.
Wait, attempted murder? How do they justify that?
Because the gun was registered to her stepfather. The prosecution argued that she could have easily used it on him if he'd been home.
So it wasn't just about the act itself, but also the potential for further violence.
Exactly. They were building a case that this wasn't some isolated incident, but a sign of something much darker lurking beneath the surface.
And the tampering with evidence charge, what was that all about?
The prosecution presented evidence, and they had receipts, that Carly tried to cover up what she did, hiding things, deleting messages.
And those actions, they painted a picture of.
Of a guilty mind, someone trying to escape the consequences of their actions.
It seems like they were really trying to drive home this idea of premeditation, that Carly knew what she was doing, knew it was wrong, and tried to get away with it.
Bingo! That was the prosecution's entire strategy, to dismantle the defense's narrative of a troubled teen who snapped under pressure.
So, with those guilty verdicts, what was Carly facing? What kind of sentence were we talking about here?
Given the charges, it was looking bleak. We're talking potentially 2 life sentences.
2 life sentences. She was 15 years old. How can they even justify that?
It's a question that continues to haunt this case. Was it truly justice? Or did the system fail Carly long before she ever stepped foot in that courtroom?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember, Carly wasn't just a defendant in a high-profile case. She was a daughter, a classmate, a real person with a story that extends far beyond the headlines.
A story that forces us to confront some very uncomfortable truths about mental health, about the justice system, and about the human capacity for both darkness and light.
So where does that leave us? With this guilty verdict, these potentially life-altering, no, life-ending sentences. Did anyone stop to think, What about Carly's mental health? Did that even factor into the equation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, it's one we might never get a straight answer to.
Because what? They don't release those details to the public?
Nope. Court records related to sentencing are often sealed, especially in cases involving minors. It's meant to protect their privacy, but it also means we're left to speculate.
And speculate people did. You mentioned earlier that the community was pretty divided over this case.
Yeah, it was a real powder keg of emotions. On one side, you had those who felt that justice had been served, period. Ashley was gone, a beloved teacher, a mother, and someone had to pay the price for that loss.
And then there were those who saw Carly as a victim too.
Absolutely. They argued that the system failed her long before that day in court.
Failed her how?
They questioned whether she received adequate mental health support, whether anyone truly understood the depth of her struggles.
So, in their eyes, it wasn't just Carly on trial, it was the system itself.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that the division wasn't always so black and white,
Yeah.
meaning some people felt both things simultaneously. They acknowledged the horror of what happened to Ashley, while also recognizing the complex reality of mental illness.
It's like they were wrestling with two truths at once, holding space for both the victim and the perpetrator,
Yeah.
who in this case were essentially the same person.
It's a deeply uncomfortable position to be in, but it speaks to the nuance of this case, the way it defies easy categorization.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. But I guess that's the point, isn't it? This isn't a simple story with a clear-cut villain and a neat resolution.
Not even close. And I think that's why the Carly Gregg case continues to resonate with people. It's a stark reminder that mental illness doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's intertwined with our families, our schools, our justice system, our entire social fabric.
So where do we go from here? What can we possibly learn from a tragedy like this?
Well, for starters, we can stop treating mental health like it's some dirty little secret.
It's like we're only comfortable talking about it when it reaches a crisis point.
Exactly. We wait for the meltdown, the explosion, the tragedy before we even acknowledge that there's a problem.
Instead of, actually addressing the issue head on.
Right. It's like we're playing whack-a-mole with mental health instead of actually treating the underlying condition. And the Carly Gregg case, it highlights the potential consequences of that silence, that stigma.
Because, let's be real, this wasn't just about Carly, was it? This was about a system that often fails to provide adequate mental health resources, especially for young people.
Absolutely. It's about a culture that often prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation, that struggles to balance accountability with compassion.
And it makes you wonder, if things had been different, if Carly had received the support she needed, if someone had recognized the severity of her struggles, could this tragedy have been prevented?
That's the question that keeps a lot of folks up at night. But instead of getting stuck in the what ifs, I think it's important to focus on what we can do moving forward.
What can we do? What can any of us listening do to make a difference?
We can start by talking about mental health, openly and honestly. We can challenge the stigma that prevents people from seeking help. We can advocate for better mental health resources in our schools, our communities, and our healthcare system.
It's about creating a world where it's okay to not be okay, where asking for help is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness.
Exactly. And it starts with each and every one of us. So if you're struggling, if you know someone who is, please reach out. There are resources available, people who care, and hope for a brighter future. Don't suffer in silence.
Well said. And for those looking for those resources, we've got you covered. We've compiled a list of organizations doing incredible work in the field of mental health. You can find those links in our show notes.
Because even though this has been a heavy topic, knowledge is power. And we believe in empowering our listeners to make informed decisions, not only for themselves, but also for their loved ones.
This deep dive has been a roller coaster, hasn't it?
Yeah.
A mix of heartbreak, anger, frustration, and hopefully a renewed sense of urgency when it comes to addressing mental health.
It's a conversation that needs to happen, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's messy.
Because silence only perpetuates the cycle, doesn't it?
Silence is the enemy here. By talking about it, by sharing our stories, by supporting each other, we chip away at the stigma and create space for healing.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this incredibly challenging but incredibly important deep dive into the Carly Gregg case. Remember, you're not alone.
We're all in this together.
If you enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into more cases like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like the video if you found the story compelling, and share it with your friends and family who might be interested in true crime and mysteries. By subscribing, you'll stay up to date with all our latest content and join a growing community of curious minds exploring the most fascinating cases. Click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything.